and welcome to another episode of the Airport Communities Podcast. My name is J.C. Harris, and I am your host for today. So we promised that today's story would review the SAMP environmental webinar from last week, but it's not. Recently, it was the anniversary of the first Lake on Fire back where I used to live. That was kind of the impetus of the whole environmental movement back in the 60s and 70s, the Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Water Act, and so forth. The funny thing about that actually used to happen here at the Des Moines Creek. People would take a match and they would drop it onto rocks and they would flame on because of untreated wastewater from the airport runoff. It wasn't like it was unknown. It just took a combination of drama and public awareness to finally do something. And there was no immediate relief thereafter. It took years to fix a lot of these problems, and the people who lived near these flaming rivers and so forth probably moved. So you kind of have to accept when you go into this that the relief is not going to be about you. It's going to be about people in the future. Obviously, residents care about now. Electeds care about getting reelected now. And that's what makes it tough. We decided we needed to start injecting our origin story, which revolves around the Sea-Tac Communities Plan, which we contend was this golden age, but you can't keep mentioning something like that without diving into it a little bit. And so we're going to give you a story from that era, which we think is relevant to now. Actually, what we're going to talk about today is sort of a cautionary tale for what happens after you catch the bus, as that saying goes. The STCP, the Sea-Tac Communities Plan, was a reaction to the second runway. And to a large extent, it's exactly what people say they want today, community engagement. We're a very community and process-oriented bunch in the Pacific Northwest. Nothing stirs our hearts like having a new committee, right? And that was the STCP. The FAA, representatives from communities, scientists, engaged people of all stripes, every month at the table working on substantial things in every domain that people care about now regarding airports. NEPA, which you've heard about, the National Environmental Policy Act, was brand spanking new. The EPA was still in control of noise and pollution, as most people think of it, even though a lot of that moved to the FAA a very long time ago. The SAMP, NEPA, all of it was managed by the FAA, not the Environmental Protection Agency. Like so many things, there are bugs in version 1. There are loopholes. And generally, you can tell how good legislation is based on how well the update process goes, how well it survives going from Rev 1 to Rev 2. Now, the Sea-Tac Communities Plan was approved in 1976, and immediately a new group called the Highline Communities Plan was put together. We got to stop for a second. See, it used to be that all of the area around the airport was unincorporated King County. And there was this umbrella group called the Highline Community Council that sort of acted like a voice for what we think of now as Burien, Sea-Tac, most of Des Moines, Normandy Park, and so forth. Game on. So the idea of the Highline Community Plan and Communities Plan, it's kind of weird that you'll see it in different versions. They could never figure out singular or plural, evidently. Its job was one portion of the Sea-Tac Communities Plan. They realized that they had to start doing property buyouts, and they wanted to establish a process for what we would call today noise land, the buffer around the airport that we mentioned last week. those rings of DNO, right? Last week we said that those rings were part of what's called noise density guidelines. It's not only defining where the rings are, but also what you can do in each ring. If that sounds like zoning to you, that is exactly what it was, which always turns into politics, right? So, Sea-Tac Communities Plan is this 3-year process. It's approved in 1976. And remember, it was a coming together of the community and the port and the FAA, but also the King County Council and all their stakeholders, which included Boeing. Now, Boeing had signaled back then an interest in moving their headquarters away from their home turf along Marginal Way. That sounds like ancient history, and it's like, well, wait, didn't they move to Chicago? Well, this was back in the 70s. Their desire was to develop a new headquarters next to Sea-Tac Airport on the west side along 12th Avenue. And if that location isn't ringing any bells at the moment, well, we'll get to that in a sec. Now, if you're of a certain age, part of your surprise, if this isn't coming to mind, is that you do remember that Boeing was coming out of one of their chronic down cycles. They have this history of boom and bust going back to their beginning, and they usually involve mass layoffs, and this was the worst. Remember that famous sign, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" Well, that was then. But by 1976, they were on their way to the true golden age, the 747, the queen of the skies. Anyhow, you can think of the STCP as sort of like a two-state solution in the Middle East. That may be too soon. But everybody approving it knew there were problems. The thought was, well, we'll just kick those down the road because it's going to be this ongoing deal, right? We all agree that there should be a noise buffer around the airport. There will be progressive compensation, as we do better, you'll do better. And when it comes to the noise buffer, the zoning, the Highline Community Plan will work out all of those pesky little details. However, 5 days after the Sea-Tac Communities Plan was ratified by the council entertained another motion to rezone 5 acres along the west side, the 30-acre buffer to protect residents of what is now Burien from airport noise. It had been agreed to as open space. This was considered a complete betrayal by community members who had participated in and supported the Sea-Tac Communities Plan. Even before the Highline Communities Plan could, sit down and get to work, there was already this notion that the West Side, which they thought would remain open space, was going to be repurposed. They immediately filed ethics complaints against the council members who voted for it, saying that they were essentially bought and paid for because they had taken campaign contributions from Boeing and should have recused themselves. And a group of residents near that 30 acres came together called the Westside Hilltop Survival Committee, and they filed a series of lawsuits that eventually went all the way to the state Supreme Court, which unanimously threw out their claims and had some fairly harsh language about their approach. In other words, just accepting a campaign contribution should not rise to the level of recusal. But we can't let that go without mentioning the other side of the coin. And if you haven't noticed anything yet, you should start noticing that these coins always have about 8 sides, like, what is that game, Dungeons and Dragons? Initially, many residents sounded very reasonable, and they insisted that if the plan really were as calm as the initial drawings had seemed, they'd be fine with it. However, what really got them going, which got zero interest from everyone on the other side, including the Supreme Court, were property values. This change offered them no additional compensation for their homes. One of their main arguments, other than feeling like there had been this bait and switch, was that the value of their homes had already plummeted once the announcement of Boeing's proposal had come to light and had, in fact, become unsaleable. They thought of it as what's that thing, the camel's nose under the tent? Because it turned out Boeing later wanted to add on to that and use a portion of the land as a heliport. They said they would only use it twice a day. Now, you might think from another side of this, the 18-sided coin, 8-sided coin, that the council was trying to compromise. Because the fact is, 5 acres is pretty small. Boeing ideally would have wanted all of it. But the discussion immediately devolved, because of this lack of trust, into the whole slippery slope argument. If Boeing was given anything, no matter how innocuous, they would then gradually start using the remainder for heavy industrial stuff, tons of trucks and cargo, and it would just be a mess. The initial fib opened the door, and nobody was ever going to believe it would be just a quiet office building or a heliport twice a day. Anything commercial was bad and should be opposed, which sounds like exactly the same trust issues we have today. And as the fight dragged on and the residents saw absolutely no empathy at all on this, their position understandably hardened. Forget compensation. They insisted on buyouts, and buyouts that were much heftier than the Port of Seattle was willing to provide. Now, the process, which went on for almost 5 years, ended only in October of '81. An interesting line in the court opinion is that they were puzzled as to why it was before them, because the actual rezone applications had never gone forward. In other words, the council had moved to allow for it, but then the applicant, Boeing, did not do anything with it and never would. Part of it is that Boeing was simply waiting for a ruling. But there's another side to it. By that court decision, Boeing had moved on, tabling the discussion until they found a more amenable environment, an area that was willing to provide them with millions in tax incentives and more land. Hello, Chicago. It would be hard to argue that having Boeing move its corporate headquarters to Chicago was a great thing for the region writ large. It probably wasn't great for the corporation either. But there's another side to it. Again, if you were having trouble visualizing the area in question, well, that's because it's now called the third runway. A decade after the decision, voters repeatedly said hell no to any of the other options, improving the rail system, siting an airport anywhere else. So the federal government, the state government, basically every one of the higher-ups felt they had no better option. The port already owns the land, and even if it means building the largest artificial wall of its type ever, they insisted they could get it up and running in a couple of years. And we don't want to sound too melodramatic or harsh, especially on those people, because obviously you can't know the future. No one is given that choice, and that certainly was not their goal. But version 1 of NEPA created some really insane incentives. You know how people say you can't fight City Hall? Well, NEPA version 1 allowed a couple hundred homeowners to do exactly that. There were enough loopholes in the original code that a couple of local attorneys, not even like national super geniuses, were able to figure it out. And this outcome was not the intent of Congress. NEPA was never meant to stop projects unless they were truly awful. It was meant to encourage better projects and provide reasonable mitigations. But in far too many cases, it just weaponized people to stop things. And there were, if you call it a success, there were some early dramatic successes like that. At bottom, that is what locals will always prefer. Nothing. Just keep things exactly the way they are. And very quickly, this binary approach became the approach in environmental law. Don't mitigate, stop. Now, if you're industry and government, you're not going to take that lying down. And aviation especially really went to town on this. The Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act, ASNA, which really should have been titled, "Let's Move Control of Noise from the EPA over to the FAA and End All These Pesky Lawsuits," Act of 1979. ASNA established the Part 150 program we have today, which we call the substitute you don't want. What got lost in the mix was the original notion of mitigation and compensation, which were at the core of the Sea-Tac Communities Plan and should have been the approach: compromise. We've interviewed dozens of residents and members of the King County Council and Boeing execs from that era. All say they were completely fed up with the escalating lack of trust, and they insist that they were operating in good faith. As we've seen, the follow-up ended up being tougher and tougher decisions, lower property values, and less opportunity for mitigation, and a system where now everything, even sound insulation, is, if it ever happens, it's based on compulsion, not doing the right thing, not compromise. Today, with the SAMP, the reason people feel so deeply disappointed is that the NEPA process has been gamed against us for a very long time. The days of the Westside Hilltop Survival Committee are over. NEPA never got to a constructive version 2. If we have not been hair on fire about the recent record of decision, it's because there really were very few ways for the port to do better. Our challenge is that a few loopholes were left, and one of them, a big one, is in Part 150, the replacement for the good system that we should have had. The loophole that remains, or one main loophole, is the fact that the replacement system is voluntary. The federal government said that it was going to buckle down on regulations and funding, but it left the field completely open to the airport operator to do whatever it wanted with its own money. It encourages airport operators to do more. The port, on the other hand, does not like spending money, so it pushes this false narrative a lot that it can't do more, when really what it's saying is it can't get federal money to do things. We've said a lot that the port used to be scandal-ridden, and part of that was they were almost perpetually broke. They really were. It's no joke. They were not doing great for most of their history, but not anymore. The port has become remarkably successful. It now has the finances to take on that voluntary approach and stop hiding behind this idea of like, oh, if only we could get federal money. So don't think of the word voluntary as like I'm volunteering to plant a couple of trees. It's permission. The port has permission. When you hear the word voluntary in any context with airport law, think of it as you have our permission to do whatever you want to help your community. That's the message that Congress has sent. That's what voluntary really means. But it's up to your local government to take on this task. This stuff is complicated, and they have the ability to go through the material, understand it, and change the dynamic. But there's that old phrase, hey, you don't get if you don't ask. And since the third runway, your local governments have not usually even bothered to ask. All the mistakes we keep making over and over again are about those distractions, which we call the casino. The port blaming the federal government or blaming someone else for things it always had the permission to do, and your local government not asking. People get tired. Over and over again, we hear people who are unhappy with the way the country is going. On all sides, right? You just sense exhaustion. People say, what can you do? And so they either give up or then they just fall for something totally cockamamie. They either get used to things being, I guess this is it, or they do something really contrary to their self-interest. That's what happens when people get frustrated long enough over time. For us, the lesson of the Westside Hilltop Survival Committee is find some way to get to a compromise that isn't all or nothing. The interesting thing for us in going through these records is that at a certain point, you never see residents and Boeing executives and county electeds in the same room. At a certain point, everybody just, talk to my lawyer, talk to my lawyer. The good thing about the STCP was that it was this unique moment where people were totally fed up over the second runway, and they were able to sit down at a table and come up with an agreement. The only problem was whoever you choose to blame did not value that agreement, how precious it was, not to mess with it until it had a chance to get fully baked. You have to be completely trustworthy with something like this, or else any peace agreement falls apart. You can keep screaming at the bad port and the evil FAA, or is it the other way around? Or you can recognize that it's your government's responsibility to keep pushing for things that it always could accomplish on your behalf. But all of us have to start thinking about successes that involve more than just stop and start. It's a fascinating question to think about versus what we ended up with, the third runway, and now the SAMP. If that had found a way to succeed, that headquarters move, imagine what the entire area could be like. And the question we always ask people is, can you imagine what success looks like?